Today we're talking about the New Testament canon. We pick up on our discussion from last time, how canon simply means a measuring stick. And here, before we jump in, just a bit of review. Now, if you haven't seen the previous segment, you might want to. This won't make as much sense without it. But the Jewish Bible, it was argued that it's set up in a way that mirrors the various phases a person will go through in life. So the TaNaK first starts with the Torah, which deals with the basics of life. Those profound existential questions about why am I here, where am I going, what's the point, as well as how do I discern right from wrong. Next phase or next section of the TaNaK is the prophets, and they show up in Israel's adolescent phase when they forget everything they knew as a child, and the prophets point back in creative fashion to the Torah. Finally, you have the Ketuvim, or the writings, which give the history and wisdom that adults generally crave. So how about the New Testament canon? Well, before jumping into the New Testament, 2 notes on the Old Testament are needed. Now, first, the Christian Bible follows a different structure than that of the TaNaK. So the TaNaK, as you recall, goes Torah, prophets, writings. Well, the Old Testament doesn't follow that structure. It goes Torah, writings, and then prophets. Now, why do this? Well, there are 2 main reasons for this. But first, I want to see if you can guess why. Now, again, before guessing, let me give you a clear picture of what exactly you're guessing. I know certain students will put up their hands to answer any potential question first, even if they don't know what the question is to begin with. So let's take a step back. Why would the Old Testament place the writings in the middle? All right, so why would the Old Testament end with the prophets rather than the writings? I'm going to give you a few seconds to guess here. First person who comes up with a bright idea, shout it out really loud. Everyone else, please just sit quietly and confused. Now, yes, you got it. The prophets come at the end of the Old Testament primarily because they point to a sequel. They beg for a part 4. So instead of pointing back to the Torah, their primary function is now read in anticipating the Mashiach, or the Messiah, also known as the Christos in Greek, or Christ, the Anointed One. In fact, in Jesus' day, the very last book of the Bible, now recall the New Testament wasn't yet written, so this is the last book of the Old Testament. Well, it ended with Malachi, who's the final of the 12 minor prophets. And Malachi ends with a fiery and apocalyptic expectation of the messenger of God who will suddenly appear in the temple, but before the refining fire of the Lord purifies the earth. So it's this cataclysmic expectation, which Jesus fulfills in a way no one had expected. He does appear in the temple, but he brings the purifying fire of the Holy Spirit. All right, so that's the end of the prophets in the Old Testament. Now, there's a second explanation as to why the Christian Old Testament ends with the prophets, and this is a little more technical, but fascinating nonetheless. When you pick up a Bible, chances are it's in English, but English is actually a relatively new language. In Jesus' time, if someone picked up a Bible, chances were it was in Greek. Now, why? Jesus actually spoke Aramaic, which is a dialect of Hebrew, but because the lingua franca of the ancient world was Greek, almost every educated person in the Mediterranean was familiar with it. The Greek translation of the Old Testament was very, very common. And the Greek Old Testament translation was known as the Septuagint, sometimes abbreviated with the Roman numeral 70, which is LXX. So the 70, and why is it called the 70? Because 70 rabbis in Egypt translated from Hebrew into Greek. So in Jesus' time, someone picked up a Bible, chances were it was the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Greek Old Testament. And it was like the King James of the ancient world. Now, to be clear, when we say King James, we don't mean this one, but the King James Bible, which is actually common, one of the most common English translations of the last 500 years. But Christians in Jesus' time, they followed the Greek Old Testament mostly rather than the Hebrew one. So, to give you an example, 300 of the 386 quotations of the Old Testament in the New are from the Greek. So what that means is 86% of the time when the New Testament refers back to the Old, it's referring back to the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. And the Septuagint didn't actually follow the structure of the TaNaK. Rather, it, like the Christian Old Testament, puts the prophets at the end rather than the middle. So, and this is something that the Christians kept. All right, so now we have an understanding of how the Christian Old Testament is structured. How about the New Testament canon? Well, it has 4 main divisions. First are the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these all give us a different perspective on the figure of Christ, which means it's time for a pop quiz. So why does the New Testament contain 4 Gospels? Why not discard 3 of them and just keep 1, or melt them down into just one narrative and burn the rest? It's a profound question, so this time I'm going to give you 15 seconds to come up with an answer. Again, feel free to blurt it out and the answer, but please stay calmly seated. Stay calmly seated. Well, maybe you didn't do so well this time, but here's the short answer. Well, it's a medium to short answer. If you saw someone walk on water, what would you do? Well, the first thing you do once you get off the boat is start telling others about it, and you're going to talk about it for the next week, and probably longer than that, maybe the rest of your life. Now, let's say, different situation here, you're old enough to drive, and brave enough as well. What happens if you're merging onto the freeway, and you see two cars collide in front of you? Now, they get out and start arguing. You pull over as a witness, and a few others as well. Well, once the police show up, they start interviewing people. They're going to try and get an account from all these witnesses. Will all the witnesses give the same account? Well, they've all seen the accident from different perspectives. So they won't have the exact same story. But nonetheless, the police will record it, and from this, a case can be made as to who is at fault. And the same idea is at work in our court system, our judicial system. Now, different scenario. Let's say we call witnesses to give an account, not of a car crash, but of a person's life. And let's say it's not just any person's life, but yours that we want an account of. Now, people are complicated enough, and if we interview 4 people who know you really well, what will we find? Well, let's say one is we interview your cousin, who might give us one perspective. We might interview another mature adult, like a parent, who gives another. Perhaps your best friend will give yet another. And your favorite teacher, probably your gym teacher or phys ed teacher, maybe English teacher, but they would give another perspective as well. Each account will differ slightly, but together they give us a broader perspective of who you are. Now let's go back to the Canon thing. Let's say you've encountered the living Jesus, one of the most intriguing and effable yet alluring persons who've ever graced our earth. Now let's say further, you've witnessed the resurrection. Well, just like the car crash, or just like the account of your own life, we're going to get a matrix of views which isn't limiting, but rather enlightening as we try to get a handle on the event and the person and the power behind it, and namely the resurrection. Now, some religious systems would insist on limiting to just one account or to just one story, but not Christianity. It provides us with 4 perspectives, 4 angles to the resurrection, so 4 gospels. And notably, John's gospel ends by noting that all the books in the world couldn't contain the person of Christ. So in other words, this Christ event, it's not something that can be fully contained. Yet these 4 perspectives point to Christ and what he's done. All right, now following the Gospels, we have an historical book. It's known as the Acts of the Apostles. And this is an account of the first generation of Christians and their lives. So you have the 4 Gospels, then you have an historical book, Acts of the Apostles. And it's actually penned by the 3rd Gospel writer named St. Luke, who provides crucial insight on how the first followers of Christ are transformed and start transforming the world through the power of the Holy Spirit. Following Acts of the Apostles, we have the letters, and there are 21 letters, 14 of which are associated with the second most important person in Christianity. His name is St. Paul, also known as Saul of Tarsus. Now, these letters are generally organized from longest to shortest, according to if they've been written to a church or to a person. So, for instance, the first group are written to churches, and they begin with the longest, Romans and your 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and so on, until we get to Paul's letters written to individuals. So 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. After Paul's letters, we have Hebrews, which kind of stands on its own, but it's associated with Paul, so they put it next to Paul's other letters. So those are the first 14. Then we have 7 other letters. These are written by apostles or their associates. So, for instance, we have 2 letters from Peter, 3 from John. We have James and Jude. So these are 7 other letters written by apostles or their associates, and sometimes they're called the Catholic epistles, meaning they're written to a universal audience. Now, at the end of these 21 letters, we have, fittingly enough, the apocalypse. In Latin, it's known as Revelation, and so that's what we get for English, the book of Revelation. But in Greek, it would be the apocalypse or apocalypsis. And it's a book of hope and revelation of what life looks like from a spiritual perspective. It's also written in a different genre from the rest of the New Testament, so it reads a bit differently, to put it mildly. But it contains the same fundamental message of hope in the resurrected Lord. So, a quick review here. The New Testament canon consists of 27 documents. There's the 4 Gospels, there's a historical book known as Acts of the Apostles, then there's 21 letters, and then the book of Revelation. All right, now finally, we might ask ourselves, why these books? So why these 27 documents? Likely you've heard of other Gospels that were written, and a few other letters too, and there are other important documents like the Didache or the teaching of the 12 apostles. Why aren't they in the Bible? Now, that's a very good question, and a topic for another segment, but I'll give you a very short answer to this right now. Each book in the New Testament is a witness to the resurrection of Christ. So pretty much every paragraph in the New Testament has this event in the background. So these books are deemed inspired by the Holy Spirit since they witness to the Christ event. Now, here are some review questions for us. First of all, how does the Old Testament differ from the TaNaK? All right. Now, why? Okay, so give 2 different reasons for these differences. Thirdly, how many documents are there in the New Testament? So we're looking for a number here. What are the 4 main divisions of the New Testament? So in what 4 groupings or genres can the New Testament be divided into? As well, why does the Bible contain 4 Gospels and not just one? So thinking about the Gospels in particular, why are there 4 of them? Okay. Next, how are the letters of Paul arranged? Okay, so in what manner are Paul's letters arranged? Which letters follow those of Paul's? Okay, so what comes after St. Paul's letters? What is the last book of the New Testament, and what is its primary message? And think back as well, what is the last book of the Old Testament, and what is its primary message? And finally, what do all the books in the New Testament serve as a witness? So to what do all these books witness to? See what you come up with.